BBOR, Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia. BlackBoxNed88 on Instagram for the bonus podcast. And just a quick reminder, every Monday is Zodiac Mondays. Wednesday is an Ask Me Anything. That's an AMA, so please drop your questions below for things that you would like discussed here on the show. And Friday is an Anything Goes. Any subject is fair game, mostly talking about true crime, serial killers, the Zodiac Killer, but any subject is welcome. All right, so please share some ideas in the comment section about what you would like to hear about on this channel, and let's get started. Hello everybody, it is Friday, welcome to the show, and today we're going to talk about the theory of the Black Venetians. This is a subject that I wanted to cover for some time, however I got caught up with a lot of material about serial killers recently, so that's why I kept pushing the subject back. There are just endless things that we can say about serial killers, and if you'd like to follow along with any of those, you can always hit that subscribe button and keep up with Black Box Online Radio. But in regards to the theory of the Black Venetians, this episode is going to contain some things that have been mentioned in a few previous segments over the last 2 years, but there will also be some additional new finds that is all going to be tied in together. That's one of the things that I wanted to do. Just like take everything and just lay it all out in somewhat of a chronological order. So how does the government function? How does any government function? And are there consequences to having a government in place, period? To do this one, we have to go back to the dawn of civilization. I mean, we have 4 major river valley civilizations at the beginning of, human extant history, for lack of a better term. And those are, of course, the Nile, which would become, ancient Egypt, right? Then the Indus, the Tigris-Euphrates, and the Huanghe. The Huanghe Valley is in China, and that became the present-day nation of China, more or less. Out of the original river valley civilizations, only the Huanghe is the one that has maintained its, what would you say, consistency, for lack of a better term. It has never fallen, more or less, and that is now the People's Republic of China. But with the Tigris-Euphrates river valleys, what happened is, as I understand it, that there was a large migration, and you could even say that the Tigris-Euphrates, Mesopotamia, spilled over into what we know as continental Europe. And this became the foundation for the Greeks and the Romans. And while Africa is going through what is called the Bantu migrations, a very vast continent. People are just roaming the lands for 3,500 years. They're exploring. This is another very natural human component. They go to the farthest edges of the land, and it's always about traversing a new aspect of the continent if it is possible. What happens is Europe is building. Greece, Rome, they were very, very strong and powerful ancient civilizations. We have the Greek civilization and the Roman Empire. But how does Venice get involved with this? Well, the theory of the Black Venetian seems to go that Rome was an empire of territory, but Venice was the empire of economics and finance, like the financial connections that are going on behind the scenes. And I'm forced to cite Webster Tarpley for a lot of this. He's the author of the book Against Oligarchy, as well as many other things. Talked a lot about not only the New World Order, but in one interview he had, he was like, there are just so many names for it. The New World Order, the deep state, people talk about the shadow government, the parallel government, the invisible government. The idea that there is this type of framework that is going on behind the scenes that people aren't truly aware of, but it is very much real, and it has very, very major consequences on our civilization. And this leads to the concept of oligarchy. Even if you think that this stuff's all going to be some far-out wacky conspiracy about how there are people behind the scenes rigging the systems, oligarchy does indeed exist. A concentration of wealth and power for the few, particularly power. But it is for the few. And with oligarchy, certain people can be absorbed into this if the oligarchs deem that they are worthy or that they are necessary. It's not like an aristocracy, which is done by bloodline. This oligarchy is done by practicality as well as just the desire for power. Because if you have an existing power structure, The people in power do not want to give that up. Instead, and I would cite Joseph Farrell and Financial Vipers of Venice for this, the people who are in power want to rig the system so that this power structure will never go away. If you look at the Roman Empire, Rome fell in 476 in the west, right? And then, of course, falls in the east much later, the fall of Constantinople. But Venice, as an empire, never fell. What happened with Venice is the power center moved from the Adriatic Sea, and Venice, with all the canals, right, moves to London. And over a long period of time, eventually, London became the center of this financial empire. Once again, the economic and financial controls that are going on behind the scenes in most international decisions. Because the stuff that Joseph Farrell likes to get into is you can have a country that is just going to say, all right, I'm going to exchange clay tablets for goods. I'm going to exchange like wooden rods for goods. We're going to exchange parchment paper for goods. You can come up with some type of monetary system within a particular country like that, and all right, that might function. But once you begin to cross borders and do something in an international way, then that is when you are going to be dealing with some type of group of individuals is going to be necessary to be monitoring these interactions and monitoring these changes, and that is going to lead to people who are actually in control of a lot of things. They're the people who are making the world go round because they're overseeing all of these interactions. And you could very simply just say that they're banksters, or you could say that they are a specific kind of bankster. And this adds in another element of corruption, and this is one of the reasons why people talk about the deep state, the New World Order. They'll talk about the invisible government, the parallel government, and it's dismissed as just being some wacky conspiracy. But you could find a large element of truth in the New World Order theories, in the invisible government theories, because corruption does indeed exist. And most of the time, people who talk about the New World Order are simply saying that something is going on behind the scenes in our governments, and it's hidden from the general public. Is that conspiratorial? Yes, absolutely. That meets our definition of a conspiracy here on this channel. Two or more people plotting and planning, usually for a malicious reason. But when we look at this empire that's happened, it's really in relation to the fact that things are going on that the general public isn't aware about, or that financial interactions across international borders have a lot of consequences that are often not reported. But people can go back through time, like the historians that I was just mentioning, and they can document these types of changes and interactions, and they find out, okay, well, here is how things began to go awry. Here's how something began to get out of control, and here's how the oligarchs began to gain more power. Here's how oligarchy began to propagate. I would also like to cite some things from Michael Hudson. He's the author of the book J is for Junk Economics, as well as a host of others, and he has some very controversial economic claims about the present day, but what I like to hear from him is more of the stuff about what he calls being a debt historian and going through that, talking about the palace economy. Now, what can happen is this element of corruption is if you have the public sector and the private sector, right? And if the private sector gets dominated by a particular entity, say banksters, for example, then the private sector can move the public sector to its advantage. And this would be one of the ways in which this empire of Venice would have functioned, and is still functioning to the present day. Because, as we said, over the centuries, for various reasons, Venice no longer became the central hub of this, and it moved toward England, London, and then the British Empire was built on the backs of these financial connections. And there are all sorts of examples that we could use to go through this, but here's a very controversial claim. The United States of America became a country after the revolution against the British, right? The Revolutionary War, taxation without representation is tyranny, all of that. However, there was a political change, and that the financial and economic connections were still in place, so that even though it looks like that America is this independent nation, which it is, I mean, for all intents and purposes, the United States of America is an independent nation, and the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland is a different nation, but the economic and financial connections are still in place. I mean, people are still conducting things like trade, people are still conducting things like bookkeeping, and there are very large financial interactions that are going on all around the world. And the people who have oversight of this and people who have access to the money and control over the money have a very influential role on the system. So that's a theory that these financial and economic controls never went away. America was free on paper, but still connected to this Empire of Venice. It's free from the Empire of Britain, but not free from the Empire of Venice, perhaps, if you would want to explore it the way. That's a very controversial statement. And then you would simply have other individuals like perhaps Howard Zinn, for example, who would say that the United States of America achieved its independence from this type of male-dominated oligarchy known as the British Empire, just institute a male-dominated oligarchy in the United States of America. But I don't even want to go down that pathway too much. I just simply wanted to point out there are many different claims, there are many different interpretations of historical events, and this is all just put in place for people to give their perspective on the issue. But this is what the theory of the Black Venetians is really sharing, is that, yes, there is this empire of economic and financial connections, but Joseph Farrell wanted to expand upon this by saying that it's also about knowledge. You see, this Empire of Venice is a little bit more than just describing the financial interactions. Yeah, of course, you got nations that conduct large-level deals and trade missions, and yes, of course, there are going to be bookkeepers who are documenting all this, but there's also this oligarchy that wants to obtain knowledge. Why is that? Because if they have the knowledge, then the other people in the world will not have it. They will have an advantage over other people, oligarchs, the few. If the knowledge and the truth is only available to the few, then the masses will not have it, and they will be at a constant disadvantage. Therefore, the power structure will never be overturned. Think about what we just said, creating a system in which the oligarchy could never be dismantled. It's rigging a system so that this group of individuals and their descendants will always be in power. And as an oligarchy, once again, they can pull new people into it if they determine that this person is very useful. An excellent 20th century example of this is somebody like Henry Kissinger, who was pulled into the realm of the Rockefellers, and perhaps some other individuals like Kramer went along with him. But in regards to the foundations of all of this, let's go back to that point about knowledge, because I was listening to an interview with Joseph Farrell that I heard before, and he did an episode on The Byte Show, BYTE. It's about 2.5 hours long, and I tried to get through all of that recently. As I said, I had heard it before, but I wanted to refresh on some of this material. And you might be wondering, well, how exactly would this Empire of Venice go from the Adriatic Sea to the United Kingdom? If I can follow what people are saying, and this includes Webster Tarpley, the banks of Venice were very, very good at what they did. And as banksters, they were able to loan credit, and also these royal kingdoms throughout the first millennia were not very good with finances. Throughout the second millennia, they weren't very good with finances. I mean, if this is true, what they tell us in high school history class, that the state of Pennsylvania was named for William Penn because the King of England owed him an enormous amount of money in a debt, and the way that they settled the debt was creating the state of Pennsylvania for the Quakers. I mean, that's probably an enormous nutshell version, but it starts with like Fort Pitt, which would go on to become Pittsburgh, and Pennsylvania and Philadelphia and all of that, and following the rivers. But this is something that tends to happen from time to time. And even at one point, the King of England took out an enormous loan from the banksters of Italy, and he used all of the British sheep as collateral. And in a previous episode, I mistakenly said that was the banks of Venice. That was actually the banks of Lombardy. Like, the British crown is taking out a very large loan from the banks of Lombardy and using all the royal sheep as collateral. In foreign governments would interact like this, and then Venice would actually become once again, the strongest entity because of its ability to oversee all the economic and financial interactions. Saying economic including a social element, whereas finance would be more about the numbers, more about the figures themselves, and not really thinking about how this would affect too many people. In regards to the concept of knowledge, this is also perhaps just a consequence of top-down leadership. There are some historical examples, such as the Praetorian Guard. If you're going to have a type of form of top-down leadership, that one level of the leadership hierarchy can say, okay, well, I'm going to have this type of bodyguard force that is going to protect everyone, or we're going to protect everyone on my level, and then anyone who's going to try and get to me is going to face, this very strong consequences. And you could see how this could just as easily play out in terms of knowledge. It doesn't always have to be done by military force. And when we look at the history textbooks that we have in junior high and high school, so much focus is on the political leaders and the military leaders, because they're the people that everybody was writing about. And you definitely would think that, the major events in history, people aren't going to be thinking about banksters all the time. Of course, it's going to come up in some discussions, like, say, for example, William Shakespeare's The Merchant of Venice, although that's literature as opposed to history. But people are going to look at people like Shylock the banker, and then they get curious, well, why is this individual depicted in such a nasty way? But in regards to about how this would take place, large-level financial and economic interactions definitely have a certain sense of value to the oligarchy. Having knowledge has a certain level of of value to the oligarchy, but it goes beyond this because it also involves the element of power. This becomes something that is only about power. And once you have access to billions of dollars, and then that just simply isn't enough, and just still there's that desire to have more control over everything. I think that there are two reasons for that. One of them is just the absolute lust of for domination and just always wanting to be more powerful. The absolute lust for power. What is that thing about power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely, or something like that? But then the other level of that is that there's something that we mentioned once when we were talking about the Church of the Moonies, and someone was saying that one of the operators of that church saying, hey, this is a $2 billion enterprise. Yes, this is a church, but it's worth $2 billion. You can't simply walk away from that because there would be so many consequences on you as an individual. So people get pulled into this dark web of corruption, this dark web of economic and financial interactions. And because there is this giant lust for power, it involves a type of desire to be greater than humanity. Because no matter what historical figure you're thinking of, whether it's the Rockefellers or the Morgans, or even going back further than that, looking at the people like the royals, the kings and queens of Europe, going back to the emperors of Rome and such, they will die eventually. And it sounds crazy, but I was listening to Alex Jones, of all people, during one of his interviews with Joe Rogan. I think it was the first one that he did, when he was trying to say, okay, here are the secrets of the global elites, and this is what the New World Order is all about. And there was one sentence in there that I thought was valuable, and he said, they are obsessed with eternal life. Most of what he was saying I didn't really think was very valuable, getting into some other things about how dark matter is gravity bleeding in from other dimensions. I'm not even sure if other dimensions have the same laws of gravity as ours, but when he said the global elites are obsessed with eternal life, why would they be obsessed with eternal life? I think that there already is something to that, because if you want to be more powerful than humanity, you would have to overcome mortality. You would have to have some way to be superior to the average person, because as we said, the kings will die, the queens will die, the emperors will die, and they are still subject to the same laws of mortality because they're just ordinary mortals at the end of the day, or at the end of their lifetime, rather. So there becomes this very intense desire to have this some way, somehow, where people are trying to become gods. And there's another level to this that is heavily, heavily documented in these theories of the Black Venetians. And it goes a little bit beyond what we were saying about the foundations of the banksters. It's when we get to an individual named Paolo Sarpi, who was a Catholic priest, but also became a very influential advisor to King Henry VIII. Paolo Sarpi is somebody who is talked about very frequently by Webster Tarpley, and Webster Tarpley frequently mentioned him in his dissertation, and we'll say some things about that in a second. But, okay, so this guy, Paolo Sarpi, does that sound like an English name? Who's he working for? The oligarchs of Venice. And then you get into other people who are trying to control the thought process of Europe in the second millennia, in the 1700s and the 1800s. And one of them in the 1700s is an individual named Abate Antonio Conti. Conti was a strong advisor to, once again, the British, as well as being in charge of the correspondence between Isaac Newton and Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz in regards to who discovered calculus. And many people would say Isaac Newton discovered calculus, but in 2018, I asked my Amazon Alexa, "Hey Alexa, who discovered calculus?" And she said calculus was discovered by Isaac Newton and Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz. Webster Tarpley's famous line on that was that what Newton discovered was called the series of fluxions and changes, and it was Leibniz who truly discovered calculus. And you might be like, why would anybody care about calculus? How is this so relevant and important? Well, it was about discrediting somebody like Leibniz because he was all about the optimism of humanity, and this is when this even gets, a little bit difficult for me to explain, because I'm like, I hope that I understand this, but it seems like this individual, Abate Antonio Conti, who's this advisor to the British Crown, becomes the most central individual to the French Enlightenment, because he is, once again, somewhat of a disinfo agent, spreading misinformation, as well as how governments encourage certain writers, they support certain writers financially, they prop up ideas that are useful to the government. And this is what we see in the French Enlightenment. It's a very, very alternative theory, and it's some very controversial stuff, because not everybody is in complete agreement about this. But the reason that I was saying that I want to make sure that I'm clear on this, the Age of Enlightenment was supposed to be about metaphysics and divine love. Then it got hijacked by the oligarchs of Venice, including this individual, and Abate Antonio Conti, who was the primary operative in this message. And then it became more about skepticism and material empiricism. And this is all of the stuff that it's a little bit pessimistic, because the first people that I ever heard say some of this were from the Lyndon LaRouche movement. They're a controversial group in their own right, but they were the first ones who were just sort of laying out the theory so clearly. For millennia, governments and these oligarchical entities are supporting writers and thinkers to control how people think, to persuade modern thought, to affect modern culture. And you can see this in the CIA examples very clearly throughout the 20th century, Operation Mockingbird, for example, but also in just perhaps a lot of the theories that people have about how the CIA will do certain events to persuade people to think in a different way. John Stockwell, the former CIA operative, highest-ranking CIA director to ever go public at the time, said very clearly, if you write a dissertation on the Vietnam War, at least a dozen sources will be CIA plans, will be plagiarized by individuals on behalf of the CIA, adding in falsifications, adding in falsehoods to make people think that history was something other than what it was, and also to hide what the CIA was actually doing, to hide what the oligarchs were actually doing, so that they have the knowledge and the general public does not. The public is just something that needs to be controlled, that needs to be dismantled, that just needs to be compartmentalized. And the public is the masses, the people. They are just entities that are very impractical. And the Lyndon LaRouche movement would always talk about how they don't like Charles Darwin. And I was like, now is this going to go into something about like young Earth creationism? No. Absolutely not. Even Jordan Peterson, of all people, just said Darwin, Freud, and Copernicus really challenged a lot of the conventional ideas that people had about the human essence. And it's just for that. It's for that reason. The reason why they don't like Charles Darwin is they say that his theories diminished the magnificence of humanity and the human spirit, and in short, he was actually doing the work of the globalists, the New World Order, the oligarchs of Venice. He just didn't know it. So this group of individuals, the oligarchs, that are based on the financial and economic connections from this quote-unquote empire of Venice, the invisible empire, the invisible government. They want human beings to be in just some type of ordinary compartmentalized state. And the reason for that is, number one, they're easier to control, but also then the oligarchs can claim the superiority that they so greatly desire once it's the lust for power, as a much more so than anything else. And it's also about preserving the existing power structure, desire, greed, selfishness, all of these things, but on steroids and amplified to the upteenth level. So when you have this type of desire constantly going on, one of the ways to make humanity seem less significant and make the oligarchs seem more godlike is to treat them like statistics, like objects, what Joseph Farrell likes to call the machine. But I really don't like that term, but I can comprehend what he's saying. It is every time you have somebody treating people like objects, then they are just not really doing the benefit of humanity. They're actually doing the benefit. They're doing the work of the globalists and the elite circles, the oligarchs, the Empire of Venice, in a totally unbeknownst way, totally unaware of it, of course. Like the people who say, oh, our bodies are just organic robots with organic computer brains. That is actually doing the work of the global elites, treating human beings like objects. And as we expand the theory of the Black Venetians, this brings us to another individual named Giovanni Giammaria Ortes, who operated in the later part of the 1700s, and he was also someone who was heavily influenced by Abate Antonio Conti. I used to read up a lot about this stuff back in 2017, so I'm a little bit rusty on the details. But with Jean-Maria Ortes, he was someone who was even once described as being Conti's protege, and in other sources he was described as being someone who is more just like another informant of the oligarchy of Venice, and he would operate in his own particular circles. So, but the point is, he became an influential individual because he created what was called the carrying capacity. And this is where the idea that the world population needs to be reduced in order for the planet to survive. And he wrote the thing about how the world can't survive with more than 3 billion people. A blatant falsehood, mind you, but things like that would be very beneficial to the global elites. Now, here are the claims that I really wanted to investigate in 2017, because I told you I'm listening to all this stuff from the LaRouche movement, and I wanted to know, is this really true? And about what would be some of the far-out claims? That the writings of Giovanni Giammaria Ortes became the foundations of individuals that we know as such as Malthus, Jeremy Bentham, James Mill, and John Stuart Mill. Their accusation was that the writings of Ortes were plagiarized by those four individuals, because Malthus is all about these things like we need to decrease the surplus population, or the exact Malthusian idea is that the world's population will exceed the capabilities of food production, and that we would all starve to death if we had a larger population. You can even see this in Ebenezer Scrooge's rant in A Christmas Carol. So then let them die and decrease the surplus population, was a widely held idea at the time when he talks about like workhouses, A Christmas Carol. And if you look at some of the other individuals like Bentham and James Mill, they would go on to write things on utilitarianism, and the idea is that they were inspired by Giovanni Giammaria Ortes and his idea that the human body was just a ball of flesh, loin, tendon, and ligament, and then it's just like held together with bones and such, more or less. Once again, treating human beings as an object. And Ortes, as I understand, was also someone who was just really set on trying to turn human beings into numbers. One reason is because, I mean, he was just a little bit weird and he was kind of a wacko in his own right, but also because it was very beneficial to the Italian oligarchs. They really thrived on that stuff. This is all controversial and theoretical. I mean, these are just some sources that have been available. One point, though, when I went through these things back in 2017 was I wanted to find out, are these claims true, right? So I was looking at the writings of Ortes that are available online. I read translations because I don't speak Italian, so I'm trying my best, right? But when I was looking at Ortes side by side with, comparing him to Malthus and comparing him to Bentham and James Mill, all right, I mean, it is very, very similar. I mean, it really does seem like there are major similarities with his writing. But then you get to John Stuart Mill, the son of James Mill, right, who really becomes the name that people would associate with utilitarianism, as well as the name that people would associate with the exchanging of ideas and the free speech advocates love to turn to John Stuart Mill, right? I could not really see that his writings were plagiarized by Giovanni Gianmaria Ortes, so I would have to reject that claim. Instead, what I think is, and this is just, my take on the subject, if anybody would like to weigh in the comments section and share something, I'm always open to correction. John Stuart Mill took the writings of his father and the research and the contemporary ideas of the time, and he expanded upon them. But, I mean, that's just my 2 cents on the subject. The bigger point is that this Empire of Venice is supporting individuals who are going to be furthering their agenda. They're using useful individuals, and Malthus and Bentham and James Mill were agents of the British East India Company, and they're putting out material that is useful to the oligarchy, and they are just viewed as like intellectuals throughout history, as well as people like Voltaire and Rousseau and de Montesquieu. Those individuals in France are viewed as, just intellectuals throughout history, but in fact, they were supported by the oligarchy of Venice because their message was more useful to the oligarchy, that was more useful to the existing power structure, whereas somebody like Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, who is talking about optimism and the essence of the human being and the value of divine love, are going to be discredited because that could create a shift in the power structure that would be to the disadvantage of the oligarchs. And this is all centralized on the connections that were established in Venice. And as we said, this gravitated toward the British Isles, and then London would become the center point of this empire. And why London? I mean, another example is simply Britain had access to much better waterways than Venice did. I mean, the Adriatic Sea, you would have to go through the Strait of Gibraltar to even get to the Atlantic Ocean, and Britain had much better access to the waterways. And what they say is that the Mongols had the largest empire ever on the history of the earth, but that was only on land. And to be honest, a lot of the areas of the Mongol Empire were some frozen patches of Siberia and what is the present-day Sakha Republic. But the Brits controlled the waterways. The British Empire controlled a lot of territory on land, as well as the passages via the sea. So this is a very valuable opportunistic way for this oligarchy to transplant. And Joseph Farrell would just like to share one more thing about how there is documentation of this connection. And I mean, if you go back to maybe high school history class or world history in college, I mean, I did Italian history once, and I complained about it every day to my best friend, and we even had this running joke where it's just like, oh yeah, just like how Ned likes Italian history, something like that. But they had the Guelphs and the Ghibellines. If I can remember this stuff, the Guelphs were people who were on the side of the Pope, and the Ghibellines were the people that were not. And so, if you look at that word Guelph, when that's translated into German, that becomes Welf. And then there's this Italian Venetian family line that intermarries with the Welfs that are called D'Este, D''E''S''T''E, and it becomes Welf d'Este. When that is translated into English, that becomes Windsor, and that becomes the Windsor family, and the Windsors. Their foundation is in Germanic, of course, like many people on the British Isles, but also Venetian. And this Venetian Empire makes its way to the British Isles. Many, many reasons about why London would be the epicenter of this empire, as opposed to a different entity, such as, or a different location anywhere in the world. Very practical at the time. But the point is that, number one, there are financial and economic connections that are going on behind the scenes. It's been going on since the beginning of civilization, since the dawn of time, ever since people began to use things like banks. The second thing is what people see in the in the news and in the media, and what people see about politicians is only on the surface. That world is very simple. Like, we have a government, but we also have financial interactions that are going on between international powers. The third point is that this oligarchy that has the ability to oversee all of these interactions that are going on in between international governments wants to have a monopoly on knowledge because of the desire for power, the desire to be greater than the masses. Oligarchs want the power. That means that the masses cannot have it. All right. Then the third one, in regards to it's more of an expansion of the point about wanting this private, secret knowledge, is that they support writers and thinkers who are very beneficial to their agenda. And this can even go. One of the accusations against John Locke is made by Webster Tarpley is that Paolo Sarpi was the source inspiration for John Locke, or that his material. What Tarpley says is John Locke plagiarized the writings of Paolo Sarpi. This whole thing about life, liberty, and property, and it was plagiarized from the writings of Paolo Sarpi, who, as we said, was an advisor to King Henry VIII. And this is just to recap some of those, that the French Enlightenment was supposed to be about metaphysics and divine love, and then it was hijacked, and people like Voltaire became very prominent because their writings were more of well, the exact line is nothing bad ever came from reading Voltaire. And I mean, I don't necessarily know if that's true or not, and I even approach this with a degree of skepticism. I think it's something that's very important to note that governments would be supporting different types of writers and thinkers, and I was even just listening to a presentation once talking about the CIA and involvement in Africa, and the CIA has been accused of supporting left-wing politicians in Africa as a way to counterbalance the authoritarian right-wing dictatorships. How do they support left-wing politicians? By propping up writers who have an agenda that is very similar to the desired political outcomes of the people that they benefit from. I mean, this stuff is happening time and time again. And it's also, I mean, I think we can say more about this in part two, but one of the points about how these ideas are shared is, if you look at somebody like Giovanni Giammaria Ortes, he operated in a way in which he worked in some of these salons of Venice, where they are very similar to what we call political think tanks, where you have individuals who have been hired by members of the oligarchy to come up with solutions to their problems. Well, what is their problem? That the general public may become too powerful and they can overtake the existing power structure, and that would destroy the oligarchy. The oligarchs wouldn't be oligarchs anymore. They wouldn't be powerful anymore. So it's very similar to having a think tank who is trying to solve a problem, whether it's military-based, strategy-based, economic-based in the United States of America. You would have people who would be doing this in the salons of Venice, as well as other parts of Italy and all across continental Europe, and then that would, as well as the British Isles, of course, and they would be doing it on behalf of power for the oligarchs. And then they find people like Giovanni Giammaria Ortes who would be trying to reduce people to numbers, trying to treat people like objects. And then those types of belief systems are very beneficial to the oligarchs. That's why they want to keep this guy around. Okay, so everybody, please stay tuned, and we will be back after this quick message. Bum ba bum 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 ba bum 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 ba bum bum bum. At this time, I would like to talk about some of the ways in which you can help Black Box Online Radio. This channel relies on your support, and the best way you can help out is just by listening to some more content. If you like what you hear, you can hit that like button, subscribe, and share with your friends on social media. But I should also say that Black Box Online Radio now has a Teespring page, and there will be some links in the description box. Please feel free to check out some of the merchandise that is available. Almost all sizes and colors are listed. So, you can also help out by going over to the Zodiac Killer channel and watching the documentary series Obsession into Darkness, parts 1, 2, and 3. I was one of the contributors for that, and you can see some other great Zodiac content on the Zodiac Killer channel. And yes, there will be a part 4 of Obsession into Darkness at some point in the future. And for now, let's get back to the show. Okay, hello everybody, welcome back. To pick up where we left off, we were talking about how the oligarchs of the city-state of Venice were able to create a system that could put financial and economic pressure on different nations and kingdoms throughout history to, in short, develop a more powerful entity that is based on oligarchy. Once again, not on bloodline, but on the usefulness and practicality of an individual that can be pulled into this group. I'm sure that aristocracy may have played a role in this at a certain time, but definitely more about how just this few group of people would want to have more power and more tyrannical desires and entities than other people around the world, simply for that, the lust for power. And one of the ways that this is done, as we said in part one, was the manipulation of the thought of the general public. But how exactly does that go about? And as it has been explored, like with some of these examples that we went through, talking about turning people into numbers and treating people like objects, just using them as statistics and formulae. The way that the oligarchy tries to manipulate humanity, as I understand it, is through the hard sciences and the social sciences. And yes, we did provide some examples about how political oppositions are supported, but that's social scientific all the same. But in regards to the examples that you could look at, say, say for instance, you're watching the television and you hear something about 4 out of 5 experts recommend this type of fertilizer. Well, which 4 out of 5 experts are those? What are their names? What exactly did they say? Like, is anybody going to Google that? Or is that just something that was made up completely? Is that total baloney? Do these experts even exist? When you hear that there is this certification and approval by someone who is an expert in the field, particularly in something to do with the hard sciences and the social sciences, the general public is more likely to go along with it. I remember even once I just turned on like a video and it was Dr. Oz talking about green coffee beans, and he said, scientists have been researching these for years. And I was like, oh, okay, well, if scientists have been researching it, they must be pretty good. And then I was like, wait a second, what? Yeah, Dr. Oz and all, but this is something that people definitely do experience, and that not everything we get in our scientific textbooks and in the social studies textbooks is accurate. That there is information that has been put out there that is beneficial to the global elite circles, and I definitely don't think that it's exactly the way that Alex Jones would want to present it to you, that there's this cabal of individuals who are running the world. I can accept that that happened at a certain time, like for example that maybe in the days of like the mid second millennium, uh, the mid second millennium, yes, that the circles of Venice were much more active in plotting and planning and micromanaging worldly events. What I think happens more frequently these days is that people will find tragedies that happen, they will find disasters, terrorist attacks, and they will use the media coverage around these very real incidents to their advantage. They'll put a spin on it to make it look like it's useful to their political agenda, or the mainstream media will only present stories on certain angles that are beneficial to the global elite agenda. I think that's much rather happening, as opposed to the globalists and the tyrants and the social engineers staging all of the terrorist attacks and actually using their own operatives to create these types of horrendous tragedies. So I think it's much more about media perception as opposed to the actual events. But that brings up a good point. In this segment here, what I really wanted to talk about is this stuff real? Because I was sitting back in 2017 and I was just watching the stuff on YouTube. I was listening to InfoWars a lot because Alex Jones would really, he would get into this material. He talks about the New World Order, but these are the origins of it, of this so-called New World Order that he was going on about. And I wanted to know, was this stuff true? And as I said, I got into Webster Tarpley and Joseph Farrell and the other members of the Lyndon LaRouche movement and everyone under the sun who was critical of these financial and economic interactions known as the Empire of Venice. So I wanted to know, is this stuff really true? And when I talk to people about this stuff, the response that I get from people who are ex-military or academics is, no, it is not true. and this is just a skeptical response that has been presented. And I'm like, well, of course, why isn't it true? And they're saying these types of historians are just cherry picking to get a desired result. They are looking at the facts and then they are using fictitious connections to link it all together. Or maybe they're only looking at some of the facts. And a big criticism that has been put in place of this type of Venetian conspiracy theory model is that it is blending the facts with far out wacky ideas. And I always misquoted that statement because I would say that it was blending the facts with falsehoods. And they're not falsehoods, not necessarily falsehoods, far out wacky ideas, meaning that it's something that may or may not be true, or that it's definitely not like completely factual. And also, one thing that academics do, and you will find this in any discipline, is they say things that they believe might possibly be true. They don't have any certainty of that particular claim, but they might present a possibility as a fact. Even in the true crime world, somebody might say something that is theoretical. And I guess a way we could phrase that is substituting personal analysis for the hard facts. And that could be one of the ways in which this has been shared. So it's just something to keep in mind that just because somebody, including me, if you've listened this far into the recording, including the things that I put forward, it's very good to challenge them. And it's good to try and find not only a point where maybe somebody said something that's factually inaccurate, but the heart and soul of the claims. Because I often find in these types of discussions, somebody will either be 100% dismissive, as we said, like, oh, you're just cherry picking to get a desired result. Oh, you're just blending in the facts with the falsehoods. That's not what's happening. That's like the entirely dismissive response to this whole Venetian model, New World Order model. And the other response is someone who will just point out a particular fact and be like, no, that's not true. On that specific day when you said that happened, it wasn't that day. It was actually 3 weeks earlier. Okay, well, I mean, that might be correct. That person might have a good point, but that doesn't change the heart and soul of the claim that there is a group of oligarchs that is using economic and financial pressures to manipulate governments on the international circuit, and that they're also trying to manipulate the general public through the persuading messages that are found in faux science and faux social science literature. I mean, that would be the larger level of the heart and soul of the issue. Like, that's the larger level on the scale of importance, rather. So I find that it's either one of those two things. People are either completely dismissive, or they like to just pull out a single factoid and they will highlight, hey, this is where you went wrong. And I'm open to correction all the time. I love it when somebody puts something in the comment section and then they're like, hey, you know that thing you said, well, that didn't actually happen. This is what really happened. And then I can go and try and verify their source. And then I'll be like, oh, all right, I see that I was wrong. And then we could do a follow-up episode talking about all the ways in which I was incorrect about something. But in regards to this setup, if we move from the 1700s and the 1800s all the way to the 20th century, we get to a particular family known as the Rockefellers. And this becomes a very clear example of how the Rockefellers are part of the oligarchy in every sense of the word, not only with their absolute wealth, not only with their ability to control certain markets and get people like John Rockefeller into the Senate, or Nelson Rockefeller becoming the Vice President of the United States. When Richard Norton Smith wrote his biography on Nelson Rockefeller, I think he referred to him as the most influential vice president who never went on to become president. But when you look at the actions of the Rockefeller family, I mean, Smith also said that Nelson Rockefeller's biggest contribution to world history was discovering Henry Kissinger. But there are people out there such as Mae Brussell who were very critical of that type of mainstream claim, saying that Henry Kissinger was all part of the global elite system from the beginning because he was a German national who came to the United States and then was heavily involved with German intelligence in World War II. And this is one thing, like, I found this one video clip of Henry Kissinger doing an interview for a German television station, and then he's like, I have a 15-year-old German it's very difficult to do a Henry Kissinger impression because he doesn't use a conventional German accent. He uses the old Frankish accent. I didn't know that. I learned about it in the comments section from other people, so it sounds really weird, and I sound even weirder doing it. But he's saying that he has the German level of a 15-year-old. That's all false. I mean, that's all baloney, because he was heavily involved with German intelligence throughout World War II, and he does public addresses in German from time to time. And where am I going with all this? That he was actually a much more influential individual than being just some guy from Harvard that Nelson Rockefeller had discovered because he was useful to the global elites. And, well, I guess we're jumping ahead a little bit there, but yes, that's one of the reasons why Henry Kissinger was able to be pulled in to this, whether it's the New World Order, the Empire of Venice, the Invisible Government. This type of oligarchical structure could absorb people like Kissinger who would be very influential. And we did one episode on the channel once where I was discussing the film Kissinger and Nixon. I think it's called Henry Kissinger Black Box Vlog, where I would do like personal segments. But I found this video on YouTube, actually. It's a movie, excuse me, called Kissinger and Nixon, all about the relationship between Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon, and the actor playing Nixon says that Kissinger may be the smartest person who ever lived. Okay, so you have somebody who is useful to the global elites, who is of above average intelligence, who might be very good at geostrategic thinking. Then somebody like Nelson Rockefeller can support this guy like Kissinger, and then Kissinger goes on to become National Security Advisor. He goes on to become Secretary of State. It's not only about what you know, but also about the connections that somebody makes. And if the connections are much stronger for a small group of people, this becomes the foundation of oligarchy. And these oligarchical connections go back further and further in time, perhaps even to the dawn of civilization, or even to the dawn of the first bank account, and when people started interacting city-state to city-state, kingdom to kingdom, empire to empire. When you have these types of interactions, and there are banksters who are involved with it, then it becomes very easy to see how these people actually have an enormous amount of power. The people who are watching the money, that is. And in terms of the present-day New World Order, Lincoln's Bible, that's the name of an anonymous researcher. We did an episode about her once on Black Box Online Radio, and she was talking about how that there's nobody at the top. There's nobody running the show now. It's just the money. It's just like where these large level transactions in the billions of dollars end up moving this way and that. It's just there are consequences of an ineffective, poorly designed system. There are consequences of top-down leadership. There are consequences of corruption and crony capitalism. And there are consequences of the human misdeed. There are consequences of that desire and lust for power, and people using corruption to further their own lust for power. And these get once you begin dealing with billion-dollar transactions, it has an enormous amount of consequences, and that's where perhaps the present-day New World Order is at. So I believe. If you want to challenge me on anything, please put your idea in the comment section below, especially if you have some type of first-hand connection with this. Maybe you've worked with economics in the past, or maybe you have worked with something to do with the government, or you're ex-military and you've recognized something. Please put your idea in the comment section below. Challenge all of this here. But in the 20th century, we see that it's not only the relationship between Nelson Rockefeller and Henry Kissinger. We also have an individual who didn't come from Germany, but Poland, rather, named Zbigniew Brzezinski. Sometimes he's called Zbigniew Brzezinski. And with Zbig, he became someone who was at the hand of David Rockefeller, the same way that Henry Kissinger was connected to Nelson Rockefeller. And then Brzezinski as well went on to become National Security Advisor under Carter. But did you ever notice how Brzezinski never went away even until his death? He was all over the television. He was all over meetings. Like when he's on like Morning Joe talking to his daughter and Joe Scarborough, he's like, oh, well, I was attending another meeting with former National Security Advisors recently. Just because he got out of office does not mean that his influence ever went away, let alone talking about how he was able to put out publications, advise other governments, and that this went on to just expand that set of oligarchical connections. But if you want to see how people like Kissinger or Brzezinski get pulled into the oligarchy, you have to go back even further to their utility during World War II. With somebody like Kissinger, his his biographer, Walter Isaacson, said that Kissinger learned from an early age that might makes right. And I don't believe that for a second. No, absolutely not. But what he was talking about was, like, Kissinger's growing up in World War II, and then Kissinger, who is Jewish, was experiencing some anti-Semitic discrimination. He would sneak in to watch football games, and the Jews weren't allowed to do that. And then when people would start to suspect that he was Jewish, he would get beaten up. And from then, like, Kissinger really learned about the necessity of fighting back, and that might can make right, in short. And then this went on to affect his thinking in the future. And you can see a lot of this with people who become somewhat either influential political players or the critics of influential political players, because we were mentioning Lyndon LaRouche in the previous segment, and Lyndon LaRouche was perhaps Henry Kissinger's largest critic. But with Lyndon LaRouche, he grew up in a Quaker family, and he was someone who was practicing nonviolence, and he was beaten up a lot as a teenager, and he greatly regretted this vow of nonviolence throughout his life, and just thought that was a complete mistake during my teen years. I should have fought back. And Lyndon LaRouche was a conscientious objector in World War II up until 1944, when he entered into the service as a medic, and then he served in India and Burma. And throughout his time in those nations in South Asia and Southeast Asia, he went on to see that the British Empire is actually a very corrupt entity, and that became the foundation of his political thinking. And then that went on to expand into a lot of the criticisms that we were going through in part one of this series, because part one of this episode, rather, talking about how, like, you need to not only be aware of what's going on, but also being able to do something in response. And it's similar to might makes right, but more about the necessity of fighting back. And I think that's a very big commonality between Kissinger and LaRouche, even though they were absolute enemies, but only in enemies. Like, this one guy on ESPN once said, it's like a rivalry that you would have where Charlie Brown versus Lucy Van Pelt, and the objective is to kick a football. Yeah, okay, it's a rivalry, except Lucy Van Pelt always wins, and Lucy Van Pelt would, of course, be Henry Kissinger, and Lyndon LaRouche would be Charlie Brown, because, once again, Kissinger went on to become National Security Advisor, he went on to become Secretary of State, and some people, in their own very articulated and opinionated way, made the prediction and claim that Henry Kissinger, even into his 90s, was the most powerful person on earth. I tend to think more of what Lincoln's Bible said, that it's just the money moving in different directions. But why would Kissinger be the most powerful person on earth? Because of his ability to interact with foreign governments, his ability to control foreign governments as a consultant, Kissinger and Associates, his ability to be an advisor to all of these different international players, and that because of these connections that he has established, he is the most influential person on Earth, as well. At a certain time he was, perhaps not now, like at the time of this recording, but then that's just it. Think about what we said about the banksters of Venice. The ability to put pressure on foreign governments so that they act in a certain way that is beneficial to the oligarchy. It's the same model. It's the same model. And, like, you could perhaps just view it as a global hierarchy, and that certain individuals are going to be involved with the global hierarchy, and they're going to become more and more powerful. And that somebody like Henry Kissinger is eventually going to be more powerful than somebody like Zbigniew Brzezinski, and somebody like Zbigniew Brzezinski is going to be more influential than somebody like Lyndon LaRouche, who isn't exactly too much involved in the power structure of the global elites, but someone who's trying to overtake it. And then they're just like Lucy Van Pelt pulling away the football from Charlie Brown, and he goes flying in the air. It doesn't work. I mean, the oligarchy is using a system that has been put in place for thousands of years so that it will never be overthrown. And it's like, it's the same model of how that the few absorb people who are useful and beneficial to their agenda, so then they can put pressure on the masses and the people who are involved with governments and the people who are involved with trade and commerce to do what they want, so it benefits the oligarchs, and the oligarchy can remain a system that cannot be broken. But what do you think? Do you agree with the skeptics who simply think that this stuff is far out wacky rambling, or do you agree with the theorists who think that they've discovered the mechanism that allows oligarchy to propagate? Please put your ideas in the comments section below about that, and we will be right back after this. Bum ba bum 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 ba bum 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 ba bum bum bum. At this time, I would like to remind everybody about YouTube Premium. If you use the YouTube Premium features, you can download Black Box Online Radio, take it on the go, out walking, in the car, anywhere and anyhow. YouTube Premium also gives you access to special YouTube original shows and YouTube music. And now, let's get back to the episode. Okay, hello everybody, and we are back. At this time, I just wanted to share that I recently discovered a series of videos, a lecture series actually, from Dr. Martin Blender here on YouTube, and I hope to be going through some more of those. But in regards to this, he begins by saying something about Venice as a city-state, an empire, or you could even apply it to some of these more conspiratorial claims that we've been looking at. And that is that Venice actually has many different islands in its city-state network. I'm sure you're familiar with the famous Venetian canals and the boats that can go up and down with people singing on them. What are they called? Gondolas or something like that? But if you look at that, they did take many different islands and waterways, and they linked it together to make a city. And if you view this as a parallel to some of the claims that we've made in the historical sense about how this Venetian empire, this theory of the Black Venetians, about how they're using economic and financial connections to link all of the worldly events together, to link the controls over foreign governments, it can be viewed in a very similar way. There is a central area, and then the same way that these canals connect to the different islands, the the Empire of Venice connects to different foreign governments and different entities and is putting pressure on them. And apparently it's been happening for thousands of years because, as we said, when Mesopotamia poured over into continental Europe, they were able to preserve a lot of the intellectual traditions and values that were associated with that. So then they could build upward from there. And they're hundreds of years ahead of the game compared to people who are doing things in a different fashion. But in regards to the Empire of Venice, there is a particular event that Dr. Blender talks about in the second millennium, and that is the Black Plague. And at this point, I mean, it's catastrophic for much of Europe, but it's also a very catastrophic on the southern European coastline with the Mediterranean. And this is another very powerful motivation for Venice to move from the Adriatic Sea and the Mediterranean, Italy, to move to London and to start using London as the power center of the world, which would expand into the British Empire. Like, I think that the biggest nutshell version of this theory would simply be that the financial controls behind the British Empire never went away, and they didn't originally come from Great Britain. They originally came from perhaps even somewhere in the Middle East, because if you look at the word Venetian and the similarity to the word Phoenician, this type of process has been going along on and on and on for centuries. So that it's an everlasting, continuous process of economic and financial pressure, as well as intelligence gathering and knowledge seeking. But the knowledge is reserved for the oligarchs, because if they know what's going on, then the general public cannot. Even the United States of America, you can have a political revolution, you can have an economic and cultural revolution, but that still doesn't break the cycle, because of how about how this network apparently not either hides in the shadows. That could be one way of looking at it, but another way of examining it is simply to say that when you have interactions between foreign governments, they're documented and people manipulate the causes and effects of these interactions, and that's one way to really solidify the theory about how this theory of the Black Venetians is functioning. Now, Dr. Martin Blender shares some things that are somewhat of a skeptical response to the theory of the Black Venetians, and his claim is a little bit more political. It's a little bit more related to territory as opposed to this web of economic and financial control that is hiding in the darkness. But his response is that, okay, after the Black Plague, you have the Portuguese who find ways to get around the world without using the Mediterranean. I mean, you have the explorers. There were the ages of exploration. The Portuguese are going to Africa, and then they're going in to Asia, Vasco da Gama and all that. And then you have Spain, which is colonizing the New World. And then you have the Treaty of Tordesillas. What was that, 1494, right? And then many nations are under the control of Spain, but of course Brazil would be Portuguese, and I think you you know that story. So there's New World colonization, and the Spanish and the Portuguese are on top of that. That means the Venetians have greatly gone down in power, and I think the exact words that he used to describe Venice post Age of Exploration were, they fell into luxurious obscurity. Luxurious obscurity. But the people who are more open to this theory of the Black Venetians simply say, hey, that's the whole point. Those are territorial claims. Those are political claims. They're not talking about the underlying framework of financial and economic exchanges that people are trying to highlight. Not to mention that people are hired to sit around and plot and plan ways to control the general public in a more effective way. I mean, absolutely, the advertising, public relations, those things definitely happen. But this will be done in a very specific way to put forward a malicious anti-human agenda. Now, we said a few things about Lyndon LaRouche, and I've never spoken to him personally, but I did talk to a member of the Lyndon LaRouche movement once about their claims and all of these things about the global elites are trying to control humanity. It's been going back to the Empire of Venice, and I was simply saying, do they really believe that stuff? Is there anyone in the world that actually believes that they're putting forward this agenda and they want to decrease the surplus population? But like, well, why would they even want to do that? Is it just so humanity would be easier to control? Is that the whole standpoint? Or the Georgia Guidestones right? Do they really believe that? And the guy went kind of blank on me. I'm like, hey, come on, I need an answer. Like, what's the real motivation for all of this lust and desire for power? And he finally gave me a response, and he said, I think those global elites are as close to pure evil as you can get. And these were more of the claims that were made by Joseph Farrell about how once you have billions of dollars and once you have an enormous amount of power, but you still want more power, then that's really when it is becoming the absolute power corrupting absolutely. But also, it's just simply the destruction of humanity because someone is only focused on their own power gain as opposed to contributing to the collective well-being of a society. And it's also against the collective cooperation of humanity. Human beings can only interact when it is done in a way in which this oligarchy can have control over it. As we said, that's why they support individuals who are beneficial to their agenda, and they're opposed to individuals who are not beneficial to their agenda. And these can be political thinkers, intellectuals, writers, anyone who is putting out a publication. Those people can be supported financially, they can be supported in terms of distribution, and their opposition can be discredited in terms of being ruined financially, or their reputation can be ruined in some way, meaning that there's a lot more calculation going on in the world than what is shared with us on the evening news. Well, what do you have to say about any of these things that we put forward here? If you would like to tell me that I'm completely wrong about everything, that this isn't what happened with the global elites, that the Empire of Venice, just like Dr. Martin Blender said, they became obscure and irrelevant after the Age of Exploration and after the Treaty of Tordesillas. Like, what do you have to say about any of that? Or do you think that this stuff is just far out wacky conspiracy rambling? Because I do have one last thing to share about that. I watched Webster Tarpley's lecture on the Venetian conspiracy 3 times. It's one of the most entertaining lectures that I have ever seen. I mean, absolutely. But I got online and I found one page on Reddit where it was just like a single post. I don't think anybody even commented to it, but it was talking about the Venetian conspiracy, the lecture by Webster Tarpley. And the guy was saying, this guy, Webster Tarpley, wrote a whole dissertation talking all about Paolo Sarpi, that advisor to King Henry VIII, but he left out all of these conspiratorial angles. Why would he do that? And this is what this guy proposed, is that you can't make shit up when you're around people who know what they're talking about. And that was his response. Do you agree with that, or do you simply agree with the fact that these are examples in history that have been overlooked and that people have given in to the controlling and manipulative attempts of the global elites which have originated from the Empire of Venice? I would love to hear your responses in the comments section. And I'm somewhat skeptical about this myself, but I definitely think that there's some people use the expression a grain of truth. I think that it's a little bit more than a grain of truth. There definitely is corruption in the world. There definitely are interactions between foreign governments on an economic and financial basis, and I'm sure at some point those things are exploited and certain people benefit from that. And I'm sure there are lasting traditional oligarchical structures that have been around for a very long time. Some of them may be based on aristocracy, others are based on utility. And I think the things that I would want to learn more about is to find some more definite answers, like, did John Locke actually plagiarize the writings of Paulo Sarpi? I looked into the claims about John Stuart Mill, as I said, but I would really want to just get the books side by side and go through that myself, as opposed to just simply sharing someone else's opinion. But I want to hear your response to this. Please share anything you want in the comments section, and you can write the show at blackboxonlineradio@aol.com. And I will see you on Instagram for the bonus podcast. Until next time.